Good morning, Warren and Charlie. My name is Walter Chang, and I'm from Houston, Texas. Can you describe how you made your investment decision to invest in Anheuser-Busch and how you estimated its intrinsic value? How long did it take you to make this decision? And is Budweiser inevitable like Coca-Cola?
I'm still drinking Coca-Cola. The meeting might get a little exciting if we were drinking Bud here. We don't get into much in the way of description of things we might be buying or selling, but the decision takes about 2 seconds. But I bought 100 shares of Anheuser I haven't looked it up, but I would say maybe 25 years ago when I bought 100 shares of a whole lot of other things. And I do that so I can get the reports promptly and directly. You can get them through your brokerage firm, but I've found that it's a little more reliable to put the stock in a direct name. So I've been reading the reports for at least 25 years, and I observe just generally consumer habits. And at a point, currently, the beer industry sales are very flat. Wine and spirits have gained in that general category at the expense of beer. So if you look at the industry figures, they're not going anywhere. Miller's has been rejuvenated to some degree. So Anheuser, which has had a string of earnings gains that have been quite substantial over the years and market share gains, is experiencing, as they've described, and they just had a conference call the other day, is experiencing very flat earnings, having to spend more money to maintain share, in some cases having promotional pricing. So they are going through a period that certainly less fun for them than it was the case a few years ago. And it's a fairly easy to understand product, and consumer behavior is fairly easy to understand. It's a very, very exceptionally strong business. In fact, what's happened in the beer industry over the last 50 years has been fascinating to me and to Charlie, because this is a brewing town that we grew up in, and Charlie knew the members of the Storrs family, a number of them well. Storrs had over 50% of the Omaha market in beer post-World War II and basically disappeared as the national brands took over. So it's an interesting phenomenon. Beer business is not going to grow significantly in the U.S. Worldwide, beer is popular in a great many places, and Anheuser will have a very strong position in it, but I would not expect the earnings to do much for some time. But that's fine with us. Charlie?
Yeah, at our scale of operation now, if we're ever going to buy into a terribly well-regarded company, we almost need a little patch of unpleasantness.
Yeah. That's been the best time to buy Berkshire, incidentally, too. I mean, we do what we're looking for is businesses with a durable competitive advantage. I don't think there's any question that Anheuser has a very, very strong consumer position. Now, as I said, Miller has been rejuvenated to some degree, but the other thing about it is, of course, in beer you do not see the prevalence of private labels or generic products that you see in a great many consumer products that have had strong positions over the years that are being attacked. So that's a small plus. But beer consumption per capita is going no place, and there's nothing that will change that. Interestingly enough, the average person in this climate drinks about 64 ounces of liquid a year, and I think it's roughly 27% of that will be carbonated soft drinks. So almost, and of course that Coca-Cola products will be 40-odd%. So of the 64 ounces of liquid that Americans are drinking every day, you can figure something like 11 ounces of that, man, woman, and child, will be a Coca-Cola product. Beer, as I remember, I could be wrong on this, but I think beer is about 10% of all liquids. So 1 out of every 10 ounces that's consumed by Americans of any kind of liquid is, I believe, is beer. Coffee, incidentally, despite what you read about, the popularity of Starbucks, which is very real, of course, but coffee has just gone down and down and down over the last 30 or 40 years. Charlie, do you have any thoughts about your consumption habits that you can talk about?
Well, there are people here that may remember Metz beer, and in this country we had more breweries. There were hundreds, and small places would have 2 or 3 brands. And this trend toward concentration into a few giants is, I think, permanent.
Yeah, Schlitz was number 1, as I remember, after World War II for a while. I think Anheuser was number 4 at that time. There's an interesting book, if you're a beer enthusiast, came out a few months ago, maybe a little longer than that, by a Wall Street Journal reporter that sort of toured the country sampling beers. I don't know how it affected his writing, but it's a pretty good book if you like reading about the history of beer. Let's go to number 3.
I'm Dudley Schroeder from Council Bluffs, Iowa. When you were younger, what first sparked your interest in investing, and what advice would you give a younger person if they wanted to invest in the stock market? Thank you.
Well, I'm not exactly. I got interested probably when I was maybe 7 or thereabouts. I wasted my time before that. It's a little like W.C. Fields. When he inherited some money, somebody asked him what he did with it, and he said he spent half of it on whiskey and the rest he wasted. So there I was, dawdling around. But I got into, my dad was in the business, so I would go down to his office and I would see these interesting books, and I would read them, and I would go down. He was on the 4th floor of what's now known as the Omaha Building at 17th and Farnham, and on the 2nd floor was Harris Uppelman Company, and they had a board, and I would go down there. The market was open on Saturdays in those days, so I could, for 2 hours, so I could go down on Saturday, and I saw all these interesting things going across the tape, and I just read a lot. I probably took every book in the Omaha Public Library, and every book they had on investing or the stock market, basically. I was very interested in the New York Stock Exchange. I thought maybe I'd want to become a specialist when I grew up, and maybe I still will. But I took all the books out. I read them. And finally, when I was 11, I bought 3 shares of stock. And I didn't know. I was fascinated by the subject. My dad got elected to Congress, so now the library became even bigger. And I took all the books I could out of there on markets, and I used a chart and do all that sort of thing. And then finally I read Graham's book when I was at the University of Nebraska, The Intelligent Investor, when I was 19, and that just changed my whole framework. But the advice I would give is to read everything in sight, and to start very young. It's a huge advantage in almost any field to start young, and if that's where your interest lies, and you start young and you read a lot, you're going to do well. I mean, there are no secrets in this business that only the priesthood knows. I mean, we do not go into temples and look at tablets that are only available to those who have passed earlier tests or anything. It's all out there in black and white. It's a simple business. It requires qualities of temperament way more than it requires qualities of intellect. I mean, if you've got more than 125 IQ, you can throw away the rest of the points or give them to your other members of the family or do something, because you don't need it in investing. But you do need a certain temperament that enables you to think for yourself, and then you have to develop a framework, and I developed it from reading Ben Graham. I didn't come up with it myself. Very simple framework. And then you have to look for opportunities that fit within that framework as you go through life, and you can't do something every day. You can learn every day, but you can't act every day. And I talked about reading the annual reports of Anheuser-Busch for 25 years, but I'd read the reports of Coca-Cola and Gillette and all kinds of companies long before we invested in them. And if you enjoy the game, you'll find that like playing bridge or playing baseball or whatever. And if you don't enjoy it, you probably won't do well on it. But I would advise you to start early, read everything in sight, look for the successful framework that's been successful for people. And there's nothing like Graham's in my view. And you'll have a lot of fun, and you'll probably make a lot of money. Charlie?
Well, I'm at a little disadvantage here. Warren has made himself into kind of a dean of investors starting as a boy, and he has a greater respect for the process than I do. I have a good bit of Keynes's attitude that money management is sort of a low calling compared to being a surgeon or a lot of other things. I think the corporate types, the corporate managers, ought to study investing better because they'd be better managers. And I think that everyone who thinks about through the investment process learns more about how the world really works. And I think that's very worth having. But I do not like as big a percentage of GDP as we now have going to money management and its attendant frictions. And I don't like the percentage of the nation's brain power that is now in all of these different forms of highly compensated money management. I don't think it's a good thing for the country, and I hate the fact that we've contributed to it by our own predilections.
Charlie is only sitting up here next to me as part of his outreach program, actually. Please don't take any pictures that you could blackmail him with being associated with me. Charlie made a very good point there about how managers could do better if they understood investments. I find it absolutely fascinating, and I've seen this throughout my life. I've seen it close up. I will have friends who are CEOs of companies, and they'll have somebody else handle their money. If you say to them, should you buy Coca-Cola or Gillette or something like that, they'll say, that's much too tough. I don't understand that sort of thing. What do I know about investing? And then some investment banker will walk in the next day with the idea they buy a $3 billion company, which is just buying a lot of shares of stock of one company. And they'll run through some little 2-hour presentation and turn it over to a strategic planning group and think that they are then the ones that should make that decision as to whether to buy multi-billion-dollar businesses when they really don't feel they're qualified to make $10,000 decisions with their own money. And it's extraordinary what you see in corporate America in the acquisition activity. It's a little like they say about making sausage and making laws. It's better unobserved. Charlie, do you have any further thoughts on that? You've seen a lot of it with me.
Well, I do think that the present era has no comparable precedent in the past history of capitalism. I think we have a higher percentage of attention of our intelligent classes into buying little pieces of paper and trying to get rich doing it, and in promotional activities with big profit sharing fees. I can recall no past era which had a similar concentration of this type of activity. Can you, Warren?
No, but I think you would say probably too that when we've seen sort of baby versions of this, something subsequently happened that
oh yes, if you want to talk about what are the future implications, a lot that I see now kind of reminds me of Sodom and Gomorrah. And
we weren't there, incidentally. I mean,
no, but there's a published account. And I think when you get as much sort of regrettable activity going on and sort of feeding on itself in frenzies of envy and imitation, that it has happened in the past that there came bad consequences.
On that cheery note, we'll move to number 5.
This weekend has really rocked. Thank you very much. And really, what is your view on PetroChina?
If you come up at the break, Charlie and I will have taken all the pieces out of here that we like best, and you will get the rest. Charlie, do you have anything to add to that?
She wants to know what you think about PetroChina.
It's funny. I saw her out there in the shopping area, and I knew that she had PetroChina on her mind. We bought PetroChina a few years ago. Again, after reading the annual report, and fortunately it was in English. It was the first stock, Chinese stock, and really the last. I mean, it won't necessarily be the last, but I mean it's the only one that we've owned so far. We put about $400 million into it. At the time, and still, it produces about 3% of the world's oil, which is a lot of oil. It produces probably 80% or so as much as ExxonMobil will produce. And it's a huge company. Last year it earned $12 billion. Now, if you look at the Fortune 500 list, my guess is you won't find more than about 5 companies in the United States that earn $12 billion or more. So it's a major company. At the time we bought it, the total market value was $35 billion. So we bought it at about 3 times what it earned last year. It does not have unusual amounts of leverage. In the annual report, they say something which very, very few companies do say, but which I think is actually fairly important. They say they will pay out about 45% of the amount they earn. So if you can buy it at 3 times earnings, what turned out to be 3 times earnings, and you get 45% of 33%, you're getting a 15% yield on your cash yield on your investment. It's a very good annual report. Chinese government owns 90% of the company. We own 1.3%. If we vote with them, the two of us control the business. And it's a thought that hasn't occurred to them, but I'll keep pointing it out. But it's a very major business at a very, very attractive, at what was a very attractive price. Unfortunately, the government shares and our shares have the same economic interest, but they are classified differently, so that the government's 90% are called one thing and the 10% with the public are called H shares. And we have to report in Hong Kong when we own 10% of a company, or we did then, 10% of a company's shares. So unfortunately, the 10% applied only to the 10% of H shares, and so we had to reveal our ownership when we only had 1% of the economic interest in the company. So we would have bought more, but the price jumped up, and we are happy to have our 1.3% or whatever it is, and we think that they've done a good job in running the business. They've got large gas reserves, which they're starting to develop now. But it's a very major enterprise. It employs almost 500,000 people. And the interesting thing was, a few years ago, relatively few people in the investment world probably even thought about the fact that PetroChina was over there and was a much larger business than most of the, well, just about any oil company in the world except for BP and ExxonMobil. Charlie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it would be nice if this sort of thing happened all the time, but that hasn't been true in recent years.
But we never, I should emphasize, I mean, the annual report of PetroChina, which, like I say, it's easy to read, understandable, they declare their policies. Anybody could get it. You can read it. We did not go over, and we never had any contact with the management before we bought the stock. We never attended an investor presentation or anything of the sort. I mean, it's right there in black and white in a report that anybody can get. And we just sit in the office and read those things, and we were able to put $400 million out that's now worth about $1.2 billion or something like that. It was interesting at the time. I think I'm right on this. At the time, Yukos, which is the big oil company in Russia, was probably far better known among the investment community in the United States than PetroChina. And I compared the two at the time, thought to myself, would I rather have the money in Russia or have it in China? PetroChina, in my view, was far cheaper, and I felt that the economic climate was likely to be better in China. You know, would I have, if it had been selling at the same multiple as a U.S. domestic company, would I have regarded it as more attractive? No. I mean, there's some disadvantages always to being in a culture that you don't perfectly understand, or where tax laws can change, your ownership rules can change. But the discount at which PetroChina was selling compared to other international oil companies was in my view at the time ridiculous. So that's why we bought it. And we will have the candy available for you at the break. Number 6.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name is Matt Sauer, and I'm from Durham, North Carolina. Many businesses are reporting rising costs and surcharges on such inputs as fuel, metals, and wood. They are often unable to pass along these costs to their consumers. If commodities stabilize at price levels above those of the past decade, will corporate margins be compromised into the future?
Well, it's a great question, and I would say that would depend very much on the industry you're talking about. But in our carpet business, for example, we've just been hit time after time, as I mentioned in the annual report, with raw material increases because there's a big petroleum derivative factor there. And we have lagged in terms of being able to put through those increases to our customers simply because we want to protect the Nebraska Furniture Marts, or those that have ordered for a reasonable period of time. And that's squeezed margins in carpet. We use lots of natural gas at Johns Manville, use lots of natural gas at Acme Brick, and that's tended to squeeze margins some. I think over time, I think there has been a lot more inflation in these basic materials. Steel has been off the chart. I think over time, the businesses with strong competitive positions manage to pass through increases in raw material costs just as they pass through increases in labor costs. But you get these temporary situations where sometimes the costs are increasing faster. I don't think the American industry, I mean, a higher cost for oil when we import 10 million barrels a day or more of oil, if we're paying $20 or so more per barrel than we were a year or two ago, that's $200 million a day is a tax. But it's more of a tax on the American consumer probably than on American business. The American business will probably be able to pass through most of those raw material cost increases. It is worth pointing out that corporate profits as a percentage of GDP are right at the all-time high, leaving out a few aberrational periods. And I would, if I had to bet on the direction of corporate profits as a percentage of GDP over the next 5 years, I would bet they would go down somewhat. But that's because they're right at this very high level. Interestingly enough, while corporate profits as a percentage of GDP are at this very high level, corporate taxes as a percentage of total taxes raised in America are very close to an all-time low. So American businesses managed to pull off a situation where they're making extremely good profits and paying a very small percentage of the total tax bill as measured in this country historically. And I'm not sure whether that could or should or will continue. But it's a very, very favorable period right now for corporate America. But that's nothing to get bullish about, because you might expect something of a reversion to the mean. Charlie?
Well, I can't add to that, but I can restate it. It's hard to know just which companies can pass through the increases in costs that come from higher commodity prices. and it's also important to know.
We like buying businesses where we feel that there's some untapped pricing power. We haven't been able to do much of that lately. But back in 1972, when we bought See's Candy, I think it was it $1.95 a pound?
Something like that.
Yeah. And they were selling 16 million pounds of candy a year, making 4 million pre-tax with about 25 million purchase price, which I would have very foolishly refused to budge on, and in history have cost us a lot of money. But one of the questions we asked ourselves, and we thought the answer was obvious, was, if we raised the price 10 cents a pound, would sales fall off a cliff? And of course, the answer, in our view at least, was that no, there was some untapped pricing power in the product. And it's not a great business when you have to have a prayer session before you raise your prices a penny. I mean, you were in a tough business then. And I would say you can almost measure the strength of a business over time by the agony they go through in determining whether a price increase can be sustained. And frankly, a good example of that is the newspaper business right now, because 30 years ago, when whatever the local daily would be had an absolute lock on the economics of the community, because it had the megaphone through which merchants had to talk if they were going to get their message across to their audience. At that time, rate increases, both circulation and advertising, were something that were almost a big yawn to most publishers. They did it annually. They did not worry about the fact that Sears or Walmart or Penny's or whomever would pull their advertising. They did not worry that people would drop their subscriptions to the paper. And they went merrily along, increasing prices, and they increased them when newsprint went up, and they increased them when newsprint went down. And it worked. And you got these very fat profit margins, and it looked like about as strong a business as you can imagine. Now publishers find themselves in a position where they agonize over rate increases, both in advertising and in circulation, because they're worried about driving away advertisers into other media, and they're worried about people when they get a 20-cent increase, per month or whatever it may be, in their circulation price, just deciding, well, I think I'll just drop it. And when they drop it, they don't usually take it up again. So that world has changed, and you could recognize the change in that world simply if you could get inside the mind of the publisher in terms of how they felt about price increases. You can learn a lot about the durability of the economics of a business by observing the behavior of the price behavior. I mean, you're seeing that. We're talking about the beer business. The beer has moved up in price every year, but there have been some rollbacks in certain areas in the last year, which means that it's getting a little bit more difficult to increase prices, even though they increase them at rates below inflation. And that's not a good economic sign. Charlie?
I have nothing to add to that.
Okay, we'll go to number 7.
The question that I have is, do you think the shift in the banking system during the 90s to finance home purchases with 0% down impacted the overall savings rate, as home purchases are the largest investment most people make, and the overall rise of home prices driven by these marginal buyers? If so, how would you suggest that we correct the problem?
Yeah, of course, anytime a home is constructed, it represents somebody's savings. I mean, the home buyer may buy it for nothing down, but that means he's borrowing 100% of the mortgage through a mortgage that somebody else has saved somewhere, maybe intermediated 3 or 4 times or something of the sort. But home construction comes about through savings. Now, there's no question that terms have become easier and easier and I've talked to certain mortgage bankers about this subject, but terms have become easier and easier as prices have increased. Now, that is absolutely counter to, how people think about lending in general. Generally, the more the asset class becomes inflated, the less a prudent banker will lend. But of course, in this country now you have mortgages intermediated in a way that the person buying the mortgage, in the case of, I'm thinking of Freddie and Fannie and other forms like that, so we're about the lower priced houses, but the mortgage buyer does not need to care about what kind of mortgage, what kind of a financial transaction the purchase is. All they have to do is look at the guarantee, and they look at that rather than whether somebody's put any money down or anything of the sort. So I think you've had easy financing facilitating a boom in real estate prices, even at the higher levels, and I think that which has occurred in other asset classes in the past. I mean, that farm bubble I talked about was facilitated by the fact that banks in small towns, who generally have been very conservative in lending, went crazy around 1980, and they lent amounts that the farm itself could never repay. They started saying a farm was an asset appreciation investment, not an income investment. And once you talk about something that's an asset appreciation investment, ignoring the underlying economics of what you're lending on, you're really talking about the bigger fool game. You're saying, that this is a silly price, but there'll be a bigger fool that comes along. And that actually can be a profitable game for a while, but it's nothing that bankers should engage in. So I would say that easy lending obviously does contribute to overall in the country to a lower savings rate, but in effect somebody has to save for somebody else to borrow. And what is happening now is the rest of the world is saving, so that in the US, in global terms I'm talking, but the rest of the world is saving, and they're sending us $2 billion. We're sending them, in effect, claims or ownership of $2 billion. They're investing $2 billion a day in the United States. But a lot of economists will say, well, that's what's really going on. The world loves our assets so much, and they have so much confidence in America, that the present current account deficit is driven by the fact they want to invest. I don't believe that at all. I think it's just silly, frankly, to make that argument. They are investing because they have to, because of our consumption habits, and not because they want to. And I think the declining dollar is evidence of that. Charlie?
I've got nothing to add to that. It's obvious that the easy lending on houses causes more houses to be built and causes housing prices to be higher probably in the new field. Eventually, of course, if you construct enough new anything, you can have a countervailing effect. In other words, if you built way too many houses, you'd eventually cause a price decline.
I'll give you a fanciful illustration. Let's just assume that Omaha had a totally constant population. No one was allowed to leave. No one was entered. Birth rate equal death rate, all of that sort of thing. So the population was constant, and nobody could build any more houses. We just passed a city ordinance to that effect. But every year, everybody sold their house to their neighbor. So first year, everybody sold their $100,000 house to their neighbor, and they both switched houses, and that was fine. And then the next year they agreed we were going to do it at $150,000. And you can say, well, how could that be? Well, we would all go to Freddie or Fannie and get our mortgages guaranteed for a larger amount, and somebody in New York or Tokyo or someplace would buy the Freddie or Fannie paper, and we'd have an influx of $50,000 per household. We'd all have the same number of houses. We'd all be living one house to a family. And we'd have marked up our houses, and we'd now have a bigger mortgage, but we'd have $50,000 more of income that year just to service a little higher mortgage. And we do the same thing the following year for $200,000 and so on. Now that would be very transparent, and people might catch on to the fact there was something funny going on in Omaha. But you can have an accidental aggregation of behavior that somewhat leads to the same effect. And if you keep marking up something, and in the process the payment for the marked up price comes from someone else who feels they are bearing no risk because they've got the government guarantee in between, the money can just flood in, and everybody feels very happy for a long time. And we don't have anything like the fanciful thing I set forth in terms of Omaha, but we have certain aspects of that, I think, going on in the economy. Charlie, would you, I'm throwing this one at you, would you agree or not?
Yeah, I do agree with that. You have buried Ponzi effects in various parts of any modern economy, and they're very important, and they're very little studied in economics.
Good morning, Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. My name is Martin O'Leary, and I'm from Austin, Texas. Mr. Buffett, given your past essays concerning the U.S. dollar and foreign exchange forward contract holdings that you have, and many countries' economic policies that have a tendency to debase their currencies, do you think that gold can be considered a viable investment alternative to paper currencies?
Yeah, we're not enthused about gold. People historically have felt that was the first refuge from a currency that was going to be decline in value. But, you know, so's a barrel of oil, so's an acre of land, so's a piece of Coca-Cola, so's See's candy. See's candy, if the dollar goes down 50%, we will be selling See's candy for double the present price. We'll be getting the same real price for See's candy. People will work the same number of minutes or hours per week in order to buy a pound or a 2-pound box of the candy. So we would much prefer some asset that is going to be useful, whether the currency is worth what it is today or 10% of what it is today, or whether people are using seashells in order to transact business, because people will go on eating and they'll go on drinking and doing various things, and their preferences will translate in real dollars into more or less the same economics for us. And we would not trade the ownership of those kind of assets for a hunk of yellow metal, which has very little real utility except for people who are looking to flee from the dollar and in our view really haven't thought through the consequences of what fleeing would, where they should flee. Charlie?
Yeah, if you have the opportunities of Berkshire Hathaway, averaged out, gold is a dumb investment.
My dad was a huge gold enthusiast, so I sat around the dinner table. My two sisters are here too. They will testify to it. We sat around listening to the virtues of gold, and that was in, we'll say, 1940, and gold at that time was $35 an ounce, and we would have had some storage and insurance costs. And, you know, here it is 65 years later, world wars, nuclear bombs, all kinds of things. And the compound rate from $35 to a little over $400, less those expenses, is not something that causes me to salivate. Number 14.
Andrew Noble from England. Apart from the catastrophic insurance events or Armageddon scenarios that you've been talking about earlier, in relation to the operations of Berkshire Hathaway, what are your greatest fears?
Well, the greatest, I would say, we don't worry about the economics of the businesses we have. We've got a very diverse group. By and large, they're very good businesses. By and large, they're run by some of the best managers in the country. But we worry about something going wrong. I mean, you heard about the Solomon thing in the movie, and I mean, we've got 180,000 people out there, and I'll guarantee you something is going wrong someplace as we talk. That's just the nature of it. But what you hope is that it's relatively unimportant, or that we catch it, but that's, you know, that is something that we know will happen. We try to have a culture that minimizes that, and I think we do have a culture that minimizes that. It's very important in our view to have the right incentives, and many places we think have incentives that aren't so good. I mean, when I get on an airplane and we own the company like NetJets, the last thing in the world I want to tell the pilot is that I'm running late and I hope we can get to New York a little faster. I mean, that is dumb to incent a pilot who may be worried that, somehow you affect his job or something, to get in a hurry about the takeoff or the checklist or whatever it may be. And companies do that time after time in their compensation plans or things that they incent people, in our view at least, to some of the wrong things. That doesn't mean nothing wrong will happen under any circumstances, but you should not have a system that causes people to, for example, worry about quarterly earnings. None of our managers do not submit budgets into almost. I have no idea what we're going to earn next quarter, and I have no implicit body language out there or anything of the sort to our managers that I'm hoping to earn X dollars per share in the quarter, because in the insurance business particularly, you can report any numbers basically that you want to if you write long tail business for a short period of time. And we've got 45 billion of loss reserves. Well, who knows whether the right figure is 45 billion or 46 or 44. And if the desire is to report some given number in a given quarter, instead of saying 45 billion, you say 44.75 billion or something of the sort. So we have no incentives in terms of how people are paid, or in terms of the fact they just don't want to let me down. Let's assume at the start of the year I asked everybody to submit budgets, and then I went out in Wall Street and preached a bunch of numbers. Even if their compensation didn't depend on it, the managers would feel, we don't want to let Warren down on this, so, we'll take an optimistic view of reserves. And that's easy to do at the end of the quarter, and we won't let him down, and then he won't look like a jerk in front of Wall Street. So we try to avoid that sort of thing. But even then, that is what we worry about. We don't worry about this place making money. I mean, we'll make money, and if we don't, it's my fault. And that's not the problem. The problem right now, in addition to the one we just talked about, the problem is deploying capital, and that's my job too. And I haven't done a very good job of that recently, but with a little luck, we will, in a different kind of market situation, we will get a chance to do that. Charlie?
Yeah, well, if you stop to think about it, the history of much of which we don't like in modern corporate capitalism comes from an unreasonable expectation communicated from headquarters that earnings have to go up with no volatility and great regularity, corporate earnings, I mean. That kind of an expectation from headquarters is not just the kissing cousin of evil, it's the blood brother of evil. And we just don't need that blood brother in our headquarters.
Businesses do not meet expectations quarter after quarter and year after year. It just isn't in the nature of running businesses. And in our view, people that predict precisely what the future will be are either kidding investors, or they're kidding themselves, or they're kidding both. And Charlie and I have been around cultures, sometimes on the board, where the ego of the CEO became very involved in meeting predictions which were impossible really over time. And everybody in the organization knew, because they were very public about it, what these predictions were, and they knew that their CEO was going to look bad if they weren't met. And that can lead to a lot of bad things. You get enough bad things anyway. I mean, but setting up a system that either exerts financial or psychological pressure on the people around you to do things that they probably really don't even want to do in order to avoid disappointing you. I mean, I just think that it's a terrible mistake, and we'll try to avoid it.
My question is related to the issue of U.S. trade deficit again and its implications on the future value of the dollar. Do you think an individual or a business owner here in the U.S. should be concerned about the purchasing power of his future dollar earnings or savings and diversify his or her investments in non-dollar-based securities?
I think it's very tough for individuals to either select individual stocks, select individual times to enter the market, select currencies. I mean, I think that's a game that they tend to get interested in at the wrong time. There's some adverse selection in terms of when people who do not follow stocks carefully get interested in stocks. And I think that, you know, the best investment you can have for most people is in your own abilities. I mean, when I talk to students, you know, I would pay a student. In many cases, I would be glad to, you know, pay them $100,000 for cash up front for 10% of all their future earnings. So if I'm willing to pay $100,000 for 10% of them, I'm valuing the whole person at $1 million, just capital value standing there in front of me. And anything you do to develop your own abilities is probably going to be, or your own business is probably going to be more productive for you than starting to think about individually making commitments into foreign exchange. If you have a good business in this country earning money in dollars, you'll do okay. I mean, you may live in a world 20 years from now where a couple percent of the GDP is going to service the debts and the ownership that we've created now by running these deficits. But you'll do fine in America, so I wouldn't worry about that much. Charlie?
Well, if you look at Berkshire, you will find that it really doesn't do much of conventional asset allocation to categories. We are looking for opportunities, and we don't much care what category they're in. And we certainly don't want to have our search for opportunities governed by some predetermined artificial bunch of categories. In this sense, we're totally out of step with modern investment management, but we think they're wrong.
Yeah. And incidentally, we have 80% of our money or more, well over 80%, tied to this country and to the dollar. So it's not like, you know, we've left the country or anything of the sort.
But when have you done a big asset allocation strategy?
Never.
Yeah.
Yeah. We end up with peculiar asset mixes. I mean, if the junk bond thing had gone on a little longer, instead of having $7 billion in there, we might have had $30 billion in. But we were doing that simply based on the fact that it was screaming at us. And we do the same thing with equities. I mean, back for many years, we had more than the net worth of Berkshire in equity positions, but they were cheap.
And I want you to remember one of my favorite sayings as you do this asset allocation. If a thing's not worth it doing at all, it's not worth doing well.
Yeah. You can see why Ben Franklin turned the mantle over to Charlie. We're going to take a break now, so you can all go out there and enjoy yourself in the adjoining room and have lunch. And we'll be back here at 12:45. And those in the other room might come back to this area because I think we'll have enough seats for everybody after lunch. Thank you, and I'll see you at 12:45. Thank you.
I'm a physician from St. Louis, and I want to thank you and everyone here because I'm one of these doctors that really doesn't know anything about money or finance. The money comes in, but I don't know what to do with it. I'm not able to really evaluate the financial strength of a company, but I can evaluate the ethical strength of the company, and that's why I feel real comfortable, I think most of us here, having our savings in Berkshire Hathaway. And
Thank you.
This question has probably been asked in different ways already, but several years ago, a fellow I know who had been manager of Magellan Fund warned that we were going to have a terrible decade or so in the stock market because of all the things people have brought up so far, the increasing interest rates and runaway spending and decreasing dollar and stagflation maybe right around the corner, Social Security problems, and even what Charlie Munger referred to is that most of our best and brightest graduates, I find, are going into money management rather than they're not becoming doctors or molecular biologists or PhDs in chemical engineering. And so in view of the fact that a year or two ago, there was still an ebullience of emotion about the stock market going up and making everyone rich just by having their money in the stock market. It seems like that ebullience has dropped, and I'm hearing an anticipation of a bear market. And you wrote, I think several years ago, that it's hard to make money in a bull market, and the real opportunities come in a bear market. So I'm wondering if you would give us a clue as to what your strategies are going to be if it's really true that the market gets dismal over the next few years.
Well, if the market gets cheaper, we will have many more opportunities to do intelligent things with money. Now, whether we'll blow on the money in the meantime or something is another question. But you know, we are going to be buying things, one thing or another, operating businesses, stocks, high yield bonds, whatever. We're going to be buying things for as long as I live. Just like I'm going to be buying groceries.
Longer than that, Warren.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Charlie is just waiting to take over after I. And I'm going to be buying groceries the rest of my life. Now, would I rather have grocery prices go up or down if I'm going to be buying groceries tomorrow and next week and next month and next year? And the answer is obviously, if I'm a net buyer, I will do better if prices are lower. We're not good at forecasting markets. I mean, knew that we were getting enormous bargains in the mid-70s. We knew that the market went crazy to some extent in the late 90s. But we don't have much. We don't spend any time. Charlie and I spend no time thinking or talking about what the stock market is going to do, because we don't know. We do know sometimes that we're getting very good value for our money when we buy some stocks or some bonds, as it may be. But we are not operating on the basis of any kind of macro forecasts about stocks. And there's always a list of reasons. You gave a few. There's always a list of reasons why the country will have problems tomorrow, but there's always a list of opportunities which don't get mentioned quite as often. So we don't sit down and make a list of the bad things that are happening in the economy and the good things that are happening, and therefore expecting the stock market. It might not. It doesn't behave that way, even if you could correctly forecast some of the bad things or good things. Overall, I'm an enormous bull on the country. I mean, over time, this is the most remarkable success story in the history of the world, if you think about it. I mean, in 1790, we had less than 4 million people in this country. There were 290 million people in China. There were 100 million people in Europe. And they all had the same intellect we had. They were in the same general climate. They had lots of natural resources. And 215 years later, those 3.9 million people, I think, actually, have 39 million people, I think, actually, have 30% or so of the world's GDP. So it does not make sense to bet against America. That doesn't mean all our policies are smart or anything, but I do not get pessimistic on the country. I worry about the big worry is what can be done by either terrorists or governments that have access to nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. But in terms of the basic economics of the country, your children are going to live better than you live, and your grandchildren are going to live better than your children live. And we do not focus on macro factors. Charlie?
Well, I agree with you that the economics of the country are probably going to increase for a considerable period ahead. But I suspect that in very important ways we are at or near the apex of a great civilization.
You heard it here first, folks. If you leave the NCB, nuclear, chemical, biological, but I do not feel that way, but you'll get to see which one of us is right 20 or 30 years from now. I have seen more people pass up opportunities because they get focused on a single economic variable or a single problem that the country faces, and they forget about the good things. If you can buy very good businesses at attractive prices, it's crazy to say, I think I'll sit this out because it might get a little cheaper next year or something of the sort, and because the world's going to go to hell. We've never operated that. We've never decided not to buy a business we like because of a macro view, have we?
Not yet.
Okay. It's hard to get him to really agree with you. I've been working on it for years. Number 11.
Jonathan Mills from London, England. What has been the single best investment of your careers, and why do you consider it to be the best, excluding Berkshire Hathaway itself?
Yeah, well, probably the best investment, if you're talking about business, was getting Charlie as a partner. And he works cheap, too. We've had, you can't measure it by dollar terms because obviously we're doing bigger things now than early on. I mean, Seas was an enormously important part of our success. It doesn't contribute a huge percentage of our net income now, but it provided income that let us buy other things in the past. It taught us a lot of lessons about business, all kinds of things. So we've probably, in terms of what it's done already and where it's going to go over time, probably the single best investment was the first half of GEICO, which we purchased for $40 million. Now, the second half cost us $2 billion. I'm glad I didn't buy it in thirds. But, that $40 million will, for half the company, will turn out very well. But GEICO, some of our businesses have growth potential, some don't. And we don't require growth potential as part of a business. If a business makes good money and we can use it to buy other businesses, one of the advantages of the Berkshire system is we have a tax efficient and kind of frictionless way of moving money to the best opportunities. And GEICO internally has still enormous possibilities for growth. Incidentally, we've I watched that movie and I kept touting the American Express card, but here is our GEICO card, which I'm sure all of you are eligible for, and I don't advise people using credit cards to revolve, but the truth is that people do. So use a GEICO card if you're going to behave in if you're going to charge anything. I still advise you to pay off your account before it starts revolving, and I think it's a terrible mistake for people to get hooked on revolving credit at high interest rates. And that's the first thing I tell students is that if they don't remember anything else I say, just don't fool around with charge cards and run up balances that keep getting larger and larger. But GEICO has well over 6 million customers now. As was mentioned, we entered New Jersey last year. We're adding very rapidly there. It's a great business model, and it's run by a superb human being and businessman, Tony Nicely, and I think it's got a huge potential. But I love them all.
Well, but GEICO, after all, cost $2 billion for the second half and a significant number of tens of millions for the first half. Now, the search expenses that brought us Ajit Jain, now there was an investment that really paid a dividend. I can think of no higher return investment that we've ever made that was better than that one. And I think that's a good life lesson. In other words, getting the right people into your system can frequently be more important than anything else.
Okay, let's try number 2.
Thank you. Bill Ackman from New York, New York. For the handful of AAA-rated companies, AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and MBIA, are under formal investigation for accounting shenanigans and are in the process of restating their financials. Like Charlie said before, I think of a AAA-rated company as an exemplar, a company that should behave with the highest accounting and ethical standards. My questions this leads me to are, how can investors comfortably invest in any financial service company when a decent percentage of the AAA-rated companies have false and misleading financials? And I guess the follow-up question is, why don't the rating agencies do some independent due diligence from an accounting standpoint so that they can help serve as a watch on this issue?
Well, financial companies are more difficult to analyze than many companies. I mean, it is more. If you take the insurance business, the biggest single element that is very difficult to evaluate, even if you own the company, is the loss and loss adjustment expense reserve, and that has a huge impact on reported earnings of any given period. And the shorter the period, the more the impact can be from just small changes in assumptions. We carry, we'll say, $45 billion of loss reserves, but if I had to bet my life on whether $45 billion turned out to be a little over, a little under, I mean, it'd be I'd think a long time. And you could just as easily have a figure of $45.5 billion or $44.5 billion. And if you were concerned about reporting given earnings in a given period, that would be an easy game to play. In a bank, it basically is whether the loans are any good. And I've been on the boards of banks, and that's, I've gotten surprises. It's tough to tell. It's financial companies. If you're analyzing something like WD-40, or See's Candy, or our brick business, or whatever, they may have good or bad prospects, but you're not likely to be fooling yourself much about what's going on currently. But with financial institutions, it's much tougher. Then you throw in derivatives on top of it, and it's no one probably knows perfectly what some of it, or even within a reasonable range, the exact condition of some of the biggest banks in the world. But that brings you back to the due diligence question of the agencies. You had very high grade, very smart, financially smart people on the boards of both Freddie and Fannie, and yet one was $5 billion and one was apparently $9 billion. Those are big numbers, and I don't think those people were negligent. And it's very, very tough to know precisely what's going on in a financial institution. Charlie and I were directors of Solomon, and Charlie was on the audit committee, and I forget the size of a few of those things that you found, but what wasn't found. And that doesn't mean that people below are crooks or anything like that. It just means that it's very tough with thousands and thousands and thousands of complicated transactions, sometimes involving the computations involving multiple variables. It can be very hard to figure out where things stand at any given moment. And of course, when the numbers get huge on both sides and you get small changes in these huge numbers, they have this incredible effect on quarterly or yearly figures, because it all comes lumped in. Those adjustments come lumped in a short period of time. So I just think you have to accept the fact that insurance, banking, finance companies, we've seen all kinds of finance company, both frauds and just big mistakes over time, just one after another over the years. And it's just a more dangerous field to analyze. It doesn't mean you can't make money on it. We've made a lot of money on it, but it's difficult. Now, obviously, a GEICO, where you're insuring pretty much the same thing, auto drivers, and your statistics are much more valid in something like that than they will be if you're taking something that like asbestos liability. You're subject to far greater errors in estimation. Doesn't mean that people aren't operating in good faith, but I would just take the asbestos estimates of the 20 largest insurance companies. I will bet you they're way off, but I don't know in which direction. And that's sort of the nature of financial companies. I wouldn't fault the rating agencies in terms of not being able to dig into the financials and find things that all of the companies that you've talked about have had big name auditors, and our auditors at Berkshire how many hours did they spend last year? I don't know what it would be, probably 60, 70,000 hours. And I'm sure at other, if you take major banks, they're spending more than that. But, can they be certain of the numbers? I doubt it. Charlie?
Yeah. Warren is obviously correct that where you've got complexity, which by its very nature provides better opportunities to be mistaken and not have it come to notice, or to be fraudulent and have it not be found out, you're going to get more fraud and mistakes than you are if you're selling a business where you shovel sand out of the river and sell it by the truckload. And just as a business that sells natural gas is going to have more explosions than a business that sells sand, a business like these major financial institutions, by its nature, is going to have way more problems, and that will always be true. And it's true when the financial institutions are owned by governments. In fact, some of the worst financial reporting in the world is done by governments, and governments, institutions like government banks in China, etc. So if you don't like the lack of perfect accounting in financial institutions, you're in the wrong world.
Good afternoon, Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. Thank you very much for your wisdom and all your investment advice. I'm Adrian Cho, and I'm from Hong Kong. Back in the old days in Hong Kong, when somebody turned 100, they got to have tea at Buckingham Palace with the Queen. I don't know what you have here in America, but I hope that in 2030 we come back to watch you do 50 push-ups at the White House.
It's not the way to bet.
Will you settle for 10?
My question comes in two parts. Firstly, in 1968-69, you liquidated all your partnerships, and I guess aside from your holdings in Berkshire Hathaway, you got completely out of the market and stayed out. In 2000-2001, you mentioned to us that in the coming decade, the markets would go at best nowhere. However, despite $50 billion in cash, you, and therefore us, remain substantially invested in the market. So my first question was, how and why is the investment climate different today than in 1968-69 that makes you comfortable remaining substantially invested?
Yeah, well, we do own certain securities which we probably wouldn't buy at these prices. Some of them we would, some of them we wouldn't. We're not unhappy with anything we own. We're not happy with putting more money in. So we're in a zone in some of those securities where we wouldn't buy and we wouldn't sell. Now, part of it, that decision relates to the kind of quantities that we deal in. I mean, if we owned 100 shares of each one of the stocks that we own, many billions of dollars worth, it would be an easier decision to go in and out. But we would face significant costs, including taxes, but in top of taxes, in trying to go in and out of the big positions we have. And basically, we like the businesses. So we are not unhappy. We may feel like we wouldn't want to buy more here, but we are not unhappy about being in the businesses in which we have big equity holdings. Now, notwithstanding all of that, a lower percentage of our intrinsic value is represented by the common stocks we own than just about at any time of our history, with the exception of a couple, the period right there at the end of 1969 when we liquidated the partnership. So we have not made any big statement by purchases of stocks or the ownership of stocks that says in any way says that we think that this is a particularly attractive time to own them. But we are not unhappy with Coca-Cola. We are not unhappy with American Express. We're not unhappy with Wells Fargo or Moody's. Those are very, very good businesses that we own. Would we be buying them at today's prices if we, well, the answer is we're not. We've got money and we may buy more later on. We're more likely to buy more later on than to sell those sort of investments. But there is a zone which, because of size, because of taxes, where we would neither be a buyer nor a seller. And we do not see lots of attractive stocks, but we also don't think that there's as much silliness in the market by far as there was 5 years ago, roughly. Charlie?
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about Berkshire lately is that if you take the last 4 or 5 things we did in the stock market with a goodly number of millions, but billions really, but small in relation to Berkshire's overall size, our record is much like it used to be in some of the best days. Where we were able to move around with small amounts of money, the results were quite respectable. But where we were facing the problems of being enormously rich, where we were prevented from the nimble money-making record of the past. I don't think that's a permanent state of affairs, but it's never going away either. But
explain that one.
Well, what I mean is that I think we may be able to deploy large amounts of money eventually at very satisfactory rates, whereas in recent times we have deployed small amounts of money at very satisfactory rates. And better small than nil. And small is still billions.
Hello, I'm Rory Johnson. I'm from Suffolk in the UK. Do you have or are there any appropriate criteria beyond purely financial returns in assessing the success or otherwise of your investments?
Well, I would say that the financial returns achieved in a way that we want them to be achieved are the determinant of whether we've made an intelligent commitment. Now, we don't get rid of companies that don't meet our original expectations. There's a section in the back of our annual report on the economic principles, and I forget which one it is. It's toward the end, but we say that Charlie and I have this quirk which business schools would teach is a mistake, in that if we have a business that's underperforming and we could sell it and achieve greater returns someplace else, we don't do it. We say that if a business is going to permanently lose money, we'll get rid of it. If it has major labor problems over a period of time, we might get rid of it. But we are not going to engage in what we call gin rummy type management, where we pick up one card and discard another. And so we will not, if a business has been disappointing to us, but we like the people there and we're not because of labor problems, and we're not going to have to put money in incessantly, we will stay with it when business school theory and management theory would say get rid of it and do something else. We don't disagree with the people that do it that way. It's just that we don't want to live our lives that way. And if we owned 100% of Berkshire, we wouldn't do it that way. And we want the shareholders to know that we have this mindset that may produce slightly suboptimal returns because of our attitude, but that's the way we're going to play it, and we tell people ahead of time that that's the way we're going to play it. We like being associated with the managers that we are, even the ones that are facing headwinds. I mean, but in a sense, you almost identify more with the ones that are facing headwinds because they're doing a hell of a job under very tough conditions. And every business decision or investment decision is going to work out perfectly, and some businesses are going to run into unexpected surprises. But the people that have gone in with us have stuck with us in times like that, and our attitude is we'll stick with them. So I would say that how the people behave with us after we buy the business is an important part of how we feel about the whole relationship as well as the returns achieved. Charlie?
Yeah, I think he's asking in part, are there some businesses we won't have as subsidiaries in Berkshire, even though they're wonderful businesses? In other words, are we rejecting some business opportunities on moral grounds?
Yeah, well, I've referred in past meetings to one we did on that basis. We will own stocks of companies where we wouldn't want to own the whole business. I mean, you can. I'm not sure that the logic is perfect on that, but we would not have trouble owning stock in a cigarette company. We wouldn't want to manufacture cigarettes. We might own a retail company that sells cigarettes. I mean, there's all kinds of gradations, but we do not. There are things we don't want to own and be responsible for their businesses where we have no problem owning their stocks or bonds. And some years back, Charlie and I went down to Memphis. Yeah, we looked at we were invited down, and we looked at a company that made a product that perfectly legal, probably one of the best businesses I've ever seen in terms of the economics of it.
Absolutely.
Still doing very well. And we met in the room we went to a hotel, we met in the room with the people that had the business, and people were perfectly decent people. And they described the business to us, and we went down in the lobby, and as I remember, we sat down in the lobby and we just decided that we didn't want to be in that business. And, the lines are not perfect on this sort of thing. I mean, I'm sure that there may be ads in the Buffalo News that are selling some investment service or something that I would cringe at if I knew the people involved or what they were selling. And if you own a big retail establishment, a retailer, general merchandise, you're probably going to be selling cigarettes when you don't think that you should smoke yourself or that your children should smoke. And they're not perfect, but we have turned down some. The most dramatic being that one because took us a trip of 1,000 miles or so to finally face up to the fact that we didn't want to own it. Charlie, do you have anything to add on that?
No, but that was interesting because we were young and poor then by modern standards, and we're very human, and we could see it was just like putting $100 million in a bushel basket and setting it on fire as we walked away. And
you're making me feel bad.
We made the decision all right and with no difficulty, but there was a certain twinge.
My name is Jay Dwight. I'm from a small town in Maine called Wilton, Maine. My question comes more of a request. And could Charlie Munger create a curriculum or a list of reading and experiences which he believes would lead to his concept of worldly wisdom? This would serve three great purposes. One, it would pass on the most valuable possession, that is your knowledge and experience, to us and to others in the future. Two, it would preserve and enhance that wealth beyond the material riches endowed on future generations. And three, it would begin to remedy the stunted educations of those, like Mr. Munger, are plunging along with ordinary will, with time to improve ourselves. Thank you.
Well, of course, Peter Kaufman has tried to do that in that book that he stitched together out of my old speeches, plus a lot else. And I didn't want to do it. And he went and saw Warren, and Warren got enthusiastic, and Warren suggested this ridiculous name, Poor Charlie's Almanac, and me to do it. But the whole idea of doing it is with just the motivation you're talking about. I think if you assimilate everything in that simple book, you will know a lot more than about 95% of your compatriots. And it's not that hard to do. So Peter Kaufman has made it easy for you.
Yeah, I couldn't be more enthusiastic about what you suggested, and it's been done. And it's a sensational book, and anybody that reads it is going to learn a whole lot and about life, and you'll learn, even get you to read it, I'll tell you, you'll even learn something about making money. And it's right next door here. They haven't sold out. Number 3, please.